All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I am so thrilled to introduce our first panelist who will be speaking to us again on Better Together and animal cruelty investigations and prevention through collaboration. First, we have Emily Lewis, who is managing attorney for the Criminal Justice Program at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. In this role, Emily oversees and triages case response and works directly with law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and rescue groups, providing direction and support for all aspects of criminal animal cruelty investigation and prosecution. She supports frontline responders by training and consulting on search warrant drafting, evidence collection, and scene processing best practices. Emily joined the Animal Legal Defense Fund after serving as staff attorney for the Oregon Humane Society in their law enforcement division, where she directly participated in hundreds of animal cruelty investigations during her time there. We also are honored to have Linda Fielder, who is the Animal Cruelty Investigations Manager for the Criminal Justice Program. As Director of Shelter Medicine and Humane Investigations at Oregon Humane, Linda oversaw every aspect of animal cruelty cases from the point that they were first reported through the victim animal's recovery and rehoming. In addition to supervising a fully operational 12,000 square foot veterinary teaching hospital and a law enforcement division with statewide jurisdiction, Linda also conceptualized and oversaw Oregon Humane's Emergency Animal Sheltering Certification Program, which was one of the first in the country. Linda is also a certified animal welfare administrator. So in addition to all of that, Emily and Linda are also the co-authors of an amazing resource, Animal Cruelty Investigations, a Collaborative Approach from Victim to Verdict. They are also both instructors for the University of Florida Maples Center for Forensic Medicine. So with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed panelists.
Thank you, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all the attendees today for taking time out of your Friday to join us to learn a little bit more about animal criminal law. We're so excited to present to you today on this topic. I also have a couple of housekeeping items. First, we wanted to let you know that because this is a presentation about investigating animal cruelty, there are some graphic images of animals who have ongoing medical issues in need of veterinary care. We wanted to make you aware of that in advance. We also wanted to let you know, while we talk about some legal issues, none of this presentation is intended to be nor should be relied on as legal advice. And finally, we want to thank the Oregon Humane Society for case studies and photos that are referenced throughout this presentation. We are excited to be the first panel in the symposium because our subject matter is going to lay a really good foundation for the rest of the speakers to build on throughout the next 2 days. We are going to talk about, have a general overview of animal criminal law in the country, what's the landscape of that right now, and who is responsible for responding to concerns of animal cruelty and where does that responsibility come from. We're going to talk about how those different entities that have a duty to respond to animal cruelty, how they can work together and what might be roadblocks to those partnerships. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Collaborative Response Project, which is currently in its pilot year. So first, and as a baseline, it's important to know that animal cruelty is a crime in every state in one form or another, and at the federal level. That is referring to either active animal cruelty, which is offenses like physical abuse or animal fighting, things of that nature. We are also talking about what's referred to as passive cruelty, so the crime of neglect or when an omission results in animal suffering versus an action resulting in animal suffering. And so like I said, it's a crime in one form or another in every state. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking about the statutes that make those offenses misdemeanors or felonies. And we are distinguishing that from the various county ordinances that might be in effect in your areas. So each county and each state might have their own ordinances that create violations for different types of offenses that can include neglect or abuse, but also cover things like nuisance and dogs at large, animals at large, things like that. But today we're focusing on those criminal statutes that create misdemeanors and felonies for offenses. If you are familiar with our organization, you know that every year we publish a compendium of all the laws in every state, and then we use an algorithm to rank each state for the strength of their laws. We don't have time today to go into the specifics of the laws in each state, and there are a lot of differences among the states, but you can go to our website and look up the laws for animal protection in each state. This map here puts a visual to that ranking that we do. So we place states in 3 different tiers, and the states that are reflected in green here are the states that have the strongest animal protection laws. The states in yellow fall into that middle tier, and the states in red are the ones who are in the lowest tier and have a little bit more work to do when it comes to their animal protection code. It's important to note, though, that this ranking is entirely based on the wording of the laws, the statutes themselves, and not the enforcement of those laws. And that matters because you can have great laws in a state like Oregon, but if you don't have entities who are enforcing those laws or have the resources and the partners to enforce those laws, then they don't do much good to help the animals in that state. So who does have a duty to respond? Whose job is it? Of course, immediately we think of law enforcement because, like I said, these laws create crimes and law enforcement enforces those laws. But in order to respond to animal cruelty successfully, there are a lot of other entities that have a responsibility to participate, and those are reflected here. So veterinarians, animal shelters, social services, and prosecutors. And we're just going to go into where does that duty stem from for each of those entities. First, for law enforcement, every officer who graduates from a police academy takes an oath. This is an example from Oregon, but every state has something similar where the officer swears to uphold the laws of the Constitution as well as the laws of their state. Because animal cruelty crimes are laws in the criminal code, law enforcement has therefore taken an oath to uphold those laws. Some states also have a statute in their code that requires or places a duty on law enforcement to follow up on concerns of animal cruelty. This is another example from Oregon, a statute that says it's the duty of a peace officer to arrest and prosecute any violator of animal cruelty. So that creates another layer of responsibility to respond to the cases. Veterinarians are another professional that takes an oath when they graduate from vet school. They take the oath you see on the left there. And the part that's underlined was added in 2010 and ties in directly to their responsibility to work towards preventing animal cruelty and partnering on these cases to protect the welfare of animals who might be living in a not good circumstances. So that's the first place where veterinarians have that responsibility to partake in these cases. And the second way is by cross-reporting. The map on the right, which you can also find on the Animal Legal Defense Fund website, shows which states require veterinarians to report to law enforcement when they have a good faith belief that animal cruelty is occurring. And the states that are in kind of the lighter purple are the states that allow veterinarians to cross-report when they believe that animal cruelty is occurring. It's called permissive reporting. And then the states that are in the gray or the white color have nothing in their statutes that indicates whether veterinarians should or should not report. And many of the states that have a permissive or a mandatory reporting requirement also include a protection to the veterinarian for civil and criminal liability for when they do make a report of animal cruelty. So an example of this is if a veterinarian sees a client at their clinic and the animal has an injury and like a broken leg, for example, and the individual tells the veterinarian what happened, and that story doesn't really match up with what the veterinarian knows the amount of force it would take to break that leg or something like that, and they think there might be some animal abuse going on in that situation, then in the bright purple states, those veterinarians are required to report that concern to law enforcement. And in the lighter purple, they are permitted to do that. And if you pair that with the oath, they have a duty to do that. Next are the animal shelters. There's not an oath that you take when you work in an animal shelter. I imagine there's some animal shelter employees in the audience today. So, so you know you're not swearing an oath when you get hired there, but every animal shelter creates a mission statement, and that that outlines what they're doing. It's essentially an oath that they are making for themselves and their employees, and that you're taking on when you join that organization. And these are just 3 examples of animal shelters across the country, all of which include language that speaks to a role that they will play in animal cruelty, responding to animal cruelty in one way or another. And this creates that duty for them to participate as well. Social services, even though they are primarily focused on human welfare, social workers absolutely have a role to play in response to animal cruelty situations, and their ethical standards, in my mind, indicate that they have a duty to play that role, because they're there to promote the general welfare of society. And any of us who have companion animals know how much that human-animal bond brings to our lives, and what we would lose if that went away for one reason or another. And in cases where mental health is a concern in the context of an animal cruelty case, or it's just there's a resource issue, and the human individual involved needs connection to social services in order to get themselves in a position that they can provide for themselves and for their animal in the way that they want to. Social workers do have a duty to help. And finally, prosecutors, they also take an oath like every lawyer when they get sworn into their state. And but in addition to that, prosecutors have higher standards that apply to them in the context of these criminal cases to issue criminal charges when that's appropriate, and exercise discretion to not pursue criminal charges when that's the appropriate route to take. And I've heard that referred to as the consideration of would pursuing charges in this case be in the interest of justice. And that's kind of a lofty question to think about, but it's important to have that be part of the thought process, because the facts in every case are so different, and we're going to talk a lot more about that today. That ties in directly to the spectrum of animal cruelty cases that individuals who are responding to them encounter. So as Laura mentioned, Linda and I spent over a decade working in humane law enforcement in Oregon. And we found, by and large in our experience, that this triangle graphic really represents how cases fell, the cases that were reported to us. So the vast majority of cases fell fell into that bottom section there, where resources and education provided to those individuals would resolve the issue. It doesn't mean that officers didn't need to respond. That absolutely needed to happen, but it definitely didn't need to result in a criminal citation and go through the criminal justice process in order to make the issue better for the animal and the human. The next level above that is monitoring and compliance. And that, again, it does not result in a criminal citation and can remedy the situation. That just means it takes a little bit more time and attention from the agencies involved to make sure that the animal is getting what they need and the person is providing that in a way that has been monitored by the responding agencies. But once you get above that level, you're getting into the realm of where an individual is knowingly, intentionally, or maliciously committing animal cruelty. And those cases more often cannot be resolved through resources and education and monitoring and compliance. There is going to be a stronger response to those cases in order to prevent additional harm to an animal who is at risk. And so an example, just to help show the distinguishing factors there, for one case that we were involved in, a man adopted a dog and every day would run that dog next to his car for about 6 to 8 miles. And he would feed that dog about half a cup of food a day, which resulted in the dog becoming emaciated, dangerously emaciated, probably one of the most emaciated dogs I've ever seen. And that's an example of an intentional conduct that is causing the animal to be in a life-threatening situation. Contrast that with another case we helped with where a man was living on Social Security only as his only source of income, caring for his beloved elderly dog. And when the time came where he needed to provide humane euthanasia for her, he couldn't afford to do so based on his income and his resources when it came to transportation and the internet. And because of that, he waited a little bit too long to euthanize his companion animal, and she did end up suffering a little bit towards the end there. But those are two cases that are starkly different, and they needed to be responded to in different ways.
Thanks so much, Emily. We're going to be referring back to that pyramid. We're going to spend a little time right now talking about some of the cases or some of the situations that we encountered in those bottom 2 hefty levels. Most of you are aware of how poverty impacts a household's ability to access things like healthy food, quality education, jobs, transportation, and other services. And when you think about poverty, think about the fact that over 19 million companion animals are living in homes where the income level is below the poverty line. And many millions more are living in middle class or working poor families that are living paycheck to paycheck. And those individuals likely don't have a safety net for emergencies that might come up either for themselves or for their pets. And for these individuals and their animals, routine veterinary care to stay healthy may be out of reach. And definitely a sudden emergency with their pet, like if their dog gets hit by a car, could throw them into an area where they've exhausted any resources that they might have had just getting that pet seen and diagnosed, let alone providing the treatment or surgery that they need to solve the problem. Many of these scenarios involve animals that are considered family, but they're suffering from neglect because their humans simply can't afford or access the care they need. Medical issues can become chronic and more painful over time, and an animal's condition can initiate calls to animal control or law enforcement from concerned neighbors or family members who really feel like neglect is being committed, and in many cases it is. Next slide, please. Veterinary medicine has made really incredible and sweeping advances over the past 20 to 25 years. Veterinarians are using state-of-the-art equipment. They're employing patented techniques in surgery and using, really elevated types of treatment and medications to make our animals healthy. Specialties have emerged like cardiology, oncology, dentistry, and our animals in our homes, our companion animals, are really have access to care really on the same level as human medicine. But because of these advances and what we know is just an increase in the cost of doing business across the globe, the cost of medical workups and treatment have gone up as well. And I thought I would just walk you guys through a few examples of cases that we would run across time and time again in our work in the field, where a pet had either an emergency situation or a chronic situation that had gone untreated. And our first recommendation to those people would be take your pet to the vet, get them well, get them the treatment that's recommended. And many times, most times they would do just that. They would present their pet to the vet, and just as an example, in some of these cases, bad skin, dermatitis, skin allergy, flea allergy, food allergy, we would see dogs like the one in the picture on this slide all the time. And a dog that has had a chronic skin condition for some time, who is presented to the veterinarian, is going to probably be, that vet's probably going to be recommending most, if not all, of the items that you see on that list. And we would expect that that initial bill, or the bill that it would take to get that dog on the road to recovery, would be anywhere from $700 to $1,000, and possibly up to $200 a month if the pet has to have prescription allergy food or ongoing medication or prescription flea control. Next slide, please. Our cats and dogs need dentistry and dental health prevention throughout their lives, just like people do. And when that has not been provided by a family for many years, as the cat or dog becomes older, more geriatric, dental disease can become really serious, very painful. It can impact their ability to eat, chew, swallow food. It can cause infections that can spread throughout the body, and it can, in some cases, be life-threatening. Dentistry is expensive for animals. It's an anesthetic procedure. It sometimes involves the need for x-rays, and to get a pet's mouth back on track can cost anywhere from $1,000 really to $3,000. Next slide, please. Emergencies come up as well. Pyometra is a condition that unspayed senior female dogs can get, and it's an infection in the uterus that is emergent and life-threatening. If a case like this comes up, it's going to come up fast, and it's probably going to be treated as an emergency at a vet clinic, which can automatically increase the fees for the examination and the surgery. But without surgery, that pet would almost certainly die. And, we're looking at, on the low end, $1,600 for that surgery and treatment, up to a few $1,000s. Next slide, please. I don't know if you've looked on Craigslist ever under farm animals that are for sale or free, but on any given day, you can get online and find people who are trying to give away a horse. When you can get a farm animal for free, put them on pasture, many people think that that's all it takes to enjoy the companionship of a horse. However, they can be very expensive to care for on a daily basis. They require periodic hoof trimming and teeth, what they call teeth floating, which is where they file down the points on the teeth so that they can actually chew and swallow hay and grass. We're looking at about $300 for just a routine farm call or visit from a veterinarian. And then every 6 to 8 weeks, the farrier call and the gritting of the teeth is something that can add up over time. And we find a lot of times that education is really what's lacking in horse cases, because people don't understand when they take on that free or very low cost horse that they are going to have to commit quite a bit of money to its care to keep it healthy and comfortable. Next slide, please. So as Laura told you, and as Emily mentioned, we spent many years at a law enforcement agency within a big humane society in Oregon. And we had statewide jurisdiction to enforce the animal cruelty laws. And I'll be honest, to start out, I approached that job with a kind of a very black and white attitude. If you do the crime, you do the time. And certainly we spent hours and resources investigating those cases in those top 2 tiers that Emily showed you on the pyramid, where people were intentionally abusing their animals, or they had locked an animal in the basement and were knowingly neglecting to feed it and clean up after it, and there was a blatant disregard for that animal's welfare. As we did the work, though, we realized that we were spending probably 70% of our time interacting with individuals who considered their companion animals family, and who told our officers time and again about the barriers to providing care. They knew there was a problem. They didn't know how to get help. And we realized the overlap and interconnectedness between no access to resources or education or support and chronic neglect of an animal. We were faced with decisions about whether to enforce the letter of the law in those cases, write up a citation, arrest that person, send them through the system, or look at other ways that we could help preserve the bond and create relationships that involve oversight, education, access to resources, and keep that animal, that family member in the home. We started looking at and thinking about how can we have more collaborative and community-centered approaches to those cases.
Yeah, so we started taking a staunch approach to advocating for collaboration when it comes to responding to animal cruelty. Of course, law enforcement is important, and there are a lot of really imperative steps that must be followed when you're investigating animal cruelty and pursuing it through the criminal process. However, law enforcement cannot successfully respond to animal cruelty in their community if they don't have the additional partners necessary to fully evaluate a case, bring all the resources to bear, like Linda was talking about, and provide that to individuals and animals in the community, and work cases through the criminal justice process with the evidence they need and that prosecutors need to get justice for the victim animals. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the different roles that each of those entities have and give some examples from our experience that demonstrate where the overlap is between all those different entities. Law enforcement, like I said, is the first responder to the situation when a report of animal cruelty comes in. And often that means that they end up being the community caretaker instead of that enforcement entity that we typically imagine when with officers responding to a criminal report of criminal conduct. So an example of this is a case came into our department, a report of a skinny black lab, and the officer responded and interfaced with the guardian of this dog, who was a woman that was struggling with some mental health issues. And she told him that her dog helped her deal with those issues and gave her confidence and security as she moved through the world navigating those issues. And the dog had an injury to his tongue, and but the injury had healed over and was resolved, but it made it difficult for the dog to eat. And so she had been feeding the dog using a syringe and wetting down the food, but she was having trouble maintaining her food supply due to her situation, her financial situation. And so the officer, over many months, continued to regularly bring her bags of dog food to feed the dog. And when he was there, he would check on the dog. And over that time, he had built up a rapport with her. They had a trusting relationship. And when the dog's condition made a turn for the worse, and he no longer appeared healthy anymore, the officer was able to have a conversation with her, and she allowed him to take the dog to a veterinarian to be examined. And turned out that the injury to the mouth had been cancer, and that cancer had returned and had spread. And so the appropriate humane thing to do for the dog would be to euthanize the dog. The officer took the dog back to the woman, let her know the diagnosis by the veterinarian, and told her he would facilitate transporting the dog for euthanasia the next day, but that she could have that night to say goodbye to her dog. And he did that. He came back the next day, brought the dog to the vet to be humanely euthanized, and then brought the ashes back to the woman. So throughout this case, the dog was thin initially, but that resolved as soon as she had that regular supply of food coming to her, and she took the time and care to wet down that food and feed the dog by hand so that he could eat that food. And that bond truly was so strong, and this officer was able to maintain that bond. But that officer relied on the veterinarian and the animal shelter who were providing that food and the medical exam in order to see this case through in that way. So that demonstrates how crucial those partners can be in resolving cases like that. Let's see. A veterinarian, to speak about it from the top tier of that triangle when it comes to cases that are going to be pursued criminally, the veterinarians are the only ones who can speak to some of the words that the animal protection statutes use. A lot of statutes say, use the phrase pain and suffering, or they say the animal must be provided necessary food, water, and shelter. And the veterinarian is going to be the one who can tell the officer, did the animal experience pain? Did the animal suffer? And for how long that went on. Also, veterinarians can use what they learn on the exam of the animal to help the investigators ask more relevant questions in their investigations. An example of this is another case in Oregon where 2 dogs were found deceased on the side of the road with a sharp injury to the back of their heads that resulted in their death. The case was reported by the owner of the dogs to law enforcement. Law enforcement took it really seriously, brought the dogs in to be necropsied or autopsied by a veterinarian. And the veterinarian commented that it seemed odd that 2 dogs of large dogs would, that someone would be able to inflict this severe of an injury to the back of the head of both of these dogs, and that it seemed to her behaviorally like it was likely the dogs knew the person who had done this, or and she had some other theories as well, and that she told the investigator who was observing the necropsy. The investigator took that information, went back to the owner of the animals to ask more about the scene, and that conversation resulted in the owner confessing to having killed the dogs because they needed to move, and he thought that was a humane way to euthanize them at the time. So veterinarians can be really crucial in identifying evidence that speaks to exact elements of the statutes that law enforcement and prosecutors need to prove. Animal shelters, as I mentioned earlier, are so crucial to these investigations. Animals are considered evidence in animal cruelty cases, the animals themselves, and they can't be held in law enforcement's evidence or property room like typical evidence can be, because they need daily care and enrichment. And animal shelters are going to be the organizations that provide that in a case. And without that, law enforcement will really struggle to respond effectively to animal cruelty situations where animals need to be removed. The picture you see here involved a case with over 200 exotic birds. And even with the well-resourced shelter that we were working with, we only had 2 or 3 employees who had the experience and expertise to safely interact with these birds, to remove them and transport them from this situation. After this case, we were contacted by a number of communities that said, we have a similar situation going on here, but we don't have the resources to be able to take in that many birds or handle them properly. Birds like macaws can be extremely dangerous if you don't know how to handle a bird of that size. They can easily take off a human finger without any problem. And so it's important to have those resources, but if you don't, it can pose a significant challenge. Social services and other agencies in your state are, again, really important partners. Even though not all of their work overlaps with animal cruelty, there certainly is probably more than they realize. Whenever we responded to a animal hoarding situation, we always would request to have a social worker or a social services person there. We know that those situations are traumatic for the animals and the individual who's living in that situation. They're suffering from living with that compulsion to hoard animals, and they truly care for those animals, and it's difficult for them to have to see those animals removed from their care all in a single day. At the same time, the animals are suffering and severely and need to be given the care that they need. And so we always want to respond with someone who can provide the necessary services to the individual who's experiencing that as well. There's also low-cost vet care agencies that do so much good in the way of preventing animal cruelty. There's an organization called Paw Team here in Oregon that provides low-cost or no-cost veterinary care to individuals living below the poverty line. And they will cross-report to law enforcement when a situation has escalated where it's no longer safe for an animal to continue living in a situation. And finally, another example of why it's so important to cross-report with these agencies, Child Protective Services, Department of Health. We had a case in which another skinny dog was reported, and the officer responded, saw that the dog was emaciated, but also noticed a young girl in the home that was of a thin stature as well, and seemed like she had development disabilities. And he reported that to Child Protective Services, who followed up, and ultimately the doctor who responded to this young girl's case said that this report from the animal cruelty officer probably ended up saving this girl's life, because she had been neglected of food similar to how the dog had been. And so you really need to be thinking about all the potential vulnerable populations who are living in a situation when you're responding. And that goes for humane investigators as well as social service or other government entities. The prosecutor is so important to these cases, because a prosecutor who won't give the time of day to these cases or deprioritizes them has a chilling effect across all of the other entities. We worked in a county where no matter how much time and effort we put into a case, no matter how strong we thought that case was, the prosecutor would never pursue charges on that case. And it resulted in agencies in that jurisdiction kind of scaling back on their response to animal cruelty, because it seemed like it wasn't being taken seriously by the prosecutor. To contrast that, we had a prosecutor who worked on a case involving an animal rescue that had kind of turned into a hoarding situation. And we processed 150 emaciated dogs out of a warehouse and collected a lot of medical evidence and transport records, because they were bringing dogs in from other states to try and adopt them out. And this prosecutor took all the information that we spent hours and hours and hours collecting and organizing for her, and she took the cell phone records and the social media information from the women involved in this rescue, who were the defendants, and brought that all together to create a timeline to really understand what happened to this case, what are all the charges that are applicable here, and took and stood with that case all the way through to get justice for all of those victim dogs. But it took a lot of effort on her part as well. And that kind of response from a prosecutor is really important to the other partners who are doing this work. And finally, I do want to mention part of the prosecutor's role is to think about going forward. If a case is going to trial and they have the opportunity to participate in sentencing recommendations, I know you're going to hear a lot more about that today, but that's part of the prosecutor's role as well, is to think about what is going to hold this person accountable, as well as prevent this from happening again to future victims.
Thanks, Emily. Since joining Animal Legal Defense Fund, one of our favorite aspects of our position is that we get to interact with and consult and support the people who are doing this work in animal investigations and prosecution all across the country. We talk to individuals from different states every day, and in the course of our work, we hear from them what the challenges are to them providing for and promoting animal welfare in their community, or enforcing the laws and bringing these cases through to trial. It's probably not a surprise to you that we hear about budget and staffing issues. This is happening in sectors all over the country, particularly in government supported or county supported agencies and organizations. Animal control officers and law enforcement officers sometimes have huge geographic areas to patrol. They're seeing budget cuts, they're seeing staffing cuts, and they're struggling to get to all of the calls in a timely manner. Law enforcement may feel like they have to choose person crimes over animal crimes, or they have to set priority levels on these cases. And so time and time again, we're hearing the impact of the budget and staffing shortages in communities. Next slide, please. In communities where they are working to combat animal cruelty and bring these cases to trial, we did hear that the collaborative partners, the experts, the people that Emily spent time with you talking about their particular roles, were not particularly good at working together. We identified that many times the players in these cases didn't understand each other's roles and sometimes didn't understand the importance of their own participation in these cases. Next slide, please. The complexity of animal cases or scenarios like Emily described, where our investigator went back again and again and educated and monitored and supported that woman who was struggling to provide for her dog with the tongue injury. Those types of cases take time and resources. And again, you know, being able to move to that next level of care and community caretaking can be prohibitive in agencies and jurisdictions where they just don't have the backup or the resources to take it on. Next slide, please. Lack of training is something that comes up again and again. We hear from animal control and animal shelters that traditional law enforcement may not be aware of the laws or understand their duty to enforce them. We hear that cases are being declined for prosecution. We hear that there's a lack of just procedural training to make cases strong so that they can be, I guess, have the integrity to make it through a trial. And on the other side, we hear that education out, which could be in the form of those community services that we're talking about, the people who spend time promoting spay neuter or offering low-cost spay neuter, organizations like Meals on Wheels that take the time to look into the welfare of animals in the home or provide pet food when they're providing meals to the seniors in the community. Just really training, education, and working together comes up again and again as a challenge to that collaborative mindset that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So as we heard these stories again and again, Emily and I just kept thinking back to our really kind of fortunate scenario that we enjoyed in our previous jobs, where we did have and could identify the community collaborative partners. And we thought about, you know, how can we take what we learned and spread that education, spread those resources, and influence other communities to work toward the collaborative response. So with ALDF's support and approval, we created what we call the Collaborative Response Project. This project is geared toward creating those partnerships with the primary players being the veterinarians, law enforcement, animal shelters, and prosecutors. We wanted to bring those groups together. We wanted to identify them, bring them together, first in person in a room, and then through support throughout a year to provide training to them so that they understand their roles, procedures within their roles, and they understand each other's roles and responsibilities and know who to call and how to work together. We also wanted to introduce the concept of education, monitoring, and compliance, and access to resources as a really functional way to get that positive outcome in those cases that sit in those bottom two tiers of the pyramid. When communities are overwhelmed with animal cruelty casework, if prosecutors have too many cases on their desk to sift through, we learned that if we're taking a different approach to those people who and those animals who just need support, we can create more bandwidth for the cases in the top 2 tiers to be properly investigated, charged, and prosecuted. Next slide, please. So what does that project look like? Like I said, we knew that we needed to train, and we knew that we needed to bring the entities together. We also knew from our work with agencies and entities around the country that, in particular, veterinary forensic services were out of reach for many jurisdictions because of the cost, or because they had to travel maybe to another state to get to a lab that could do a forensic necropsy on an animal. So we made sure to build in funding for services and also the proper equipment that they need to process these crime scenes in the field and to do the veterinary forensic workups. We heard that cost of care for animals that are seized in connection with an animal cruelty case can add up and blow the budgets of, an animal sheltering entity. And so we made sure that our project added in access to additional funding should a large case come up where animals are being held for an extended period of time as evidence, and there would be funding to support that. And then once the training and the parameters of the project were laid out, we made sure that we included a year of real-time support for veterinarians, law enforcement, and prosecutors for a year. In order to find we got a whole country, we've got people applying from all over. In order to find that right jurisdiction to launch this project, we interviewed over 20 applicants, and we kept identifying the same roadblocks that we were hearing from people around the country just doing the course of our work. And so the roadblocks that you see here on this slide were some of the ones that were identified by the jurisdiction that we eventually chose to participate in this pilot year. Next slide, please. We selected McHenry County, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And we selected them because even though they identified all the roadblocks on the previous slide, they had been working to improve their procedures and policies. They had been meeting those challenges by trying to effect solutions. And so as we interviewed them, every entity that we interviewed, whether it was the state's attorneys, the veterinarian, or the law enforcement agencies, they all had an optimism about their potential to do well. And, McHenry County, Illinois is a large geographic area. They're served by several police agencies and a county sheriff's department. They have kind of a unique demographic in terms of their animal population, because even though they're a suburb of Chicago, they have a lot of horses and farm animals as well as suburban areas. So there was a broad range of animals that we could be helping. And we did throughout the selection process, and through the help of our interviewees, we were able to really hone in on very specific areas that needed improvement. Next slide, please. So our first area of focus was to get the training underway, and we developed a handbook that gave everyone access to the county ordinances for McHenry County and the laws that apply, the state laws that apply to animals. Brought everybody in the room together. We did breakout exercises. We had a focused session just for the prosecutors. And then we had a third day, full day forensic veterinary training as well. Now that the project is underway, we're doing weekly case consultation, and we're providing that real-time support. And even though the cases that we're currently helping with, I'm really not able to discuss in detail because they're active investigations, we have had cases where we assisted the Large Animal Humane Society. They have an equine humane society there with working with the Department of Ag and traditional law enforcement to seize a number of horses. And we were there with them to help guide through the process of scene evaluation, evidence collection, forensic veterinary workup, and then the task of putting the case packet together and writing reports and submitting that to the prosecutor. We also had a case where we brought Child Protective Services into the loop on a case that Animal Control had investigated, where they were concerned for not only the number of animals in the home, but the dangerous behavior, dangerous levels of infighting and fighting among large dogs in a home that had 6 to 8 children under 7 in the home. So this was a case where Child Protective Services was not only notified, but they really relied on Animal Control as the experts to say, this is what we saw, this is what we believe is the potential for injury and risk to these children. And they work together, both entities using their own particular silo of expertise, but melding together to make sure that the children in the home were safe, the animals were also in a safer environment in the end. Next slide, please. So we are experiencing, we're kind of in the third quarter of our project now, and what we're experiencing is enhanced cooperation and communication between the collaborative entities. The case examples that I told you about on the previous slide, understanding and becoming comfortable with the supplies and equipment that they have been given and how to use those, and then really communicating and enjoying the improved outcomes in cases when efforts are combined, either in the cases that go through citation and prosecution or the cases that are resolved through education and access to services. Next slide, please. With any project, we want to be sure that what we're doing is paving the way for us to continue doing good work in the future. So we're always looking at ways we can improve, procedural improvements, new opportunities. How do we measure our impact? And most importantly, a plan for sustainability. And that's kind of two prongs in this situation. We want McHenry County to continue doing the work that we have supported them in beyond the termination of the project date, beyond turnover in the sheriff and in different agencies. We want the information and the knowledge to be passed down so that they continue doing good work as a community and collaboratively. And then how can we at ALDF roll out this project to more jurisdictions in the future, whether it's by utilizing McHenry County as a mentor to train other jurisdictions in Illinois, or expanding to include 3 or 4 jurisdictions in a grant year in different ways. So we're examining our success, and we're looking forward to expanding our reach in the future. Next slide, please. So if you're watching this today and the concept of collaborative response sounds like something that you could utilize in your work, or if you'd like to pass it on to the leadership in your county or your community, you can watch for the Collaborative Response Project application to open in the next few months. You can watch our website for that to happen, and then encourage your agency or agencies in your community to apply. We also, as Laura mentioned, did write a book called Victim to Verdict for short, that is really a foundational manual for all of the partners that Emily introduced you to today, how to work together, how to conduct animal cruelty investigations from the ground up, really. And it includes over 100 forms and templates that your agencies can download and edit and alter to fit your needs. And really just please reach out to us at ALDF, because our job is to support these partners in positive outcomes for animals. And regardless of the collaborative response project and whether or not your agency is involved, we do the work of consultation, support, grant funding on a case-by-case basis around the country. So please call us at the beginning of a case so that we can help you to the best of our ability.
Thank you, everyone, for your time today. We really appreciate that. And Laura, we're ready for questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Linda and Emily, for that fantastic presentation. And thank you to our viewers and listeners, because we've gotten a lot of really creative and really specific questions about the presentation and this field of work. So I'll start with a resource question. On your last point there, Linda, one individual asked if ALDF provides any resources for direct care of animals in these cruelty situations who are in need of, food, housing, veterinary care.
Certainly, yeah. The costs associated with holding seized animals or animals in dependency of their waiting for their court case or for a resolution that would allow them to be adopted is something that ALDF recognizes can be costly and prohibitive. So if you have animals in your shelter that fit this description, please reach out to us, because we do have case-by-case grant funds available to help offset that cost to your organization.
Thanks, Linda. And then another really group of questions that we've gotten relates to filing an animal cruelty complaint for members of the public who have witnessed animal cruelty. And in particular, not only what is the actual process of contacting law enforcement, but one individual asked a question relating to fear of retaliation by, especially when a lot of those who witness animal cruelty are neighbors, they're members of the community. If someone is worried about, a neighbor getting angry or some other kind of, retaliation measure being taken, what are some strategies for those folks who want to report animal cruelty, but want to do so? Is partnering with an organization like ALDF an option, or what are some other ways for either of you to answer?
I can go first. To start with the first part of that question, because about who to report to and how, because animal cruelty is a crime, it's absolutely appropriate for you to report that to your local law enforcement agency. Depending on if you're actively witnessing it happening, call 911. If it's something that's chronic and ongoing, every police agency will have a non-emergency number that you can call to report a concern, and that would be a good place to start. If you have a humane society or animal rescue in your community that has an investigations department or aspect to it, that's another option. They, on their website, will probably have instructions on how to report through them. It's always good, the more details you can provide, the better. Anything that's firsthand information that you witnessed directly is going to be the most helpful. And timelines surrounding what you saw and when, and the numbers of animals, all the details of that nature are really helpful when initially receiving a report. To speak to the second part of that question, I definitely understand that fear, and that's valid. It's difficult to navigate in the context of these cases, because I know we're all compelled to want to speak up for these animals, and it's so important that we do, because they can't for themselves. But it's difficult for law enforcement to keep someone anonymous in the course of an investigation like that, because there are eventually rules down the line that require them to disclose where they got their information from. When we worked in the law enforcement realm, on occasion, we would get handwritten letters with no return address that were anonymous, as a way of reporting a situation. And it does make it makes it a little bit harder, but if there are concrete details in there that raise a suspicion that something is occurring, then we would go and check into that if we had the address and the information that we needed to follow up on it. Using another agency like ALDF to help maintain anonymity can be difficult as well, because law enforcement does need those concrete details in order to support their probable cause and cases to move them forward. So I think if you are witnessing something really egregious and you have that fear, we can consult with you about that on that particular case to see if there's a creative way to help keep you protected, but still respond to the concern. Linda, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, that's great. That is true.
Thank you, Emily. And then related, we also got a question about what to do if, a complainant, an individual who has filed an animal cruelty complaint, if they feel that just enforcement action has not been taken at all, or has not been taken to the extent that they think is appropriate, if there is no actual investigation, and or if there are no animal cruelty charges brought by the prosecutor.
Well, I always encourage people to be persistent, with the caveat that you don't want to become annoying when you're asking for details or follow-up in these cases. And requests for information and follow-up can be something that law enforcement is happy to do. It could be something that an agency is absolutely unwilling to do. It could be something that they're unable to do if it's an active investigation and they're still at work, collecting evidence and understanding details of the situation. So in some cases, we know that these reports are not a priority, and for all of the reasons that we talked about in the presentation. I would encourage you to research who has jurisdiction in your area. In some cases, you can find a certified humane agent or animal control who can also follow up or could be reported to. And then, if you really on the other side of the spectrum, if you live in a community where you encounter a lack of response time and time again, you feel like it's not a one-off or a question of whether they can give you details, simply they're not following up. Often working with county commissioners and bringing your concerns to light can be a step toward helping communities understand that this is the responsibility of law enforcement to investigate and identify some of those challenges and barriers. And then again, to plug ALDF, we can help communities, not just through the project, but besides the project, help them create ways to be more effective, have better understanding through training or consultation on what their roles are and what their responsibility is.
Thank you, Linda. And I think we have time to squeeze in one more question. And this relates to the veterinarian's role in an animal cruelty case, as you both touched on. The question is, does a veterinarian need to have special education in forensics to actually be able to assist fully on an animal cruelty case, and specifically at a crime scene?
I can speak to that. So when a veterinarian graduates vet school, they have all of the expertise that brings them into that realm of authority on animal welfare, proper care and husbandry, and what is and is not a healthy or injured or ill animal. What they might not have is an understanding or training on evidence collection, chain of custody, how to write a report that can be used in a procedure or understood by a prosecutor. So my answer is kind of multifaceted. On the one hand, they are fully trained and aware of, they possess all the knowledge that they need to be effective in forensics or crime scene processing. They can identify what's there and what's not, what's evidence and what's not. And if they are in, and of course, you know, I would utilize any veterinarian in these cases that's willing to help. But the sooner that individual can avail themselves of additional training or meet with a prosecutor or understand from the enforcement agency what they need in terms of all of those other pieces that fit more in the police work realm, they're going to be even more successful and helpful and more of a resource.
Thank you, Linda. Well, we do have to wrap. Unfortunately, I want to thank Linda Fielder and Emily Lewis for that fantastic presentation.